Hey, Alive Again family. For today's Bible in a Year reading, we're going to be talking about Genesis chapters 1 through 3. After reading Genesis chapter 1, two words came to my mind: intention and provision. First, let's talk about God's intentionality. Genesis is an origin story. It makes me think of when you recommend a book or a TV show to a friend and you urge them to get through the beginning because it will all make sense in the end. There's the introduction, the big moment that changes everything, the hero, and the redemption story. Man, the Bible is cool, but we'll talk more about that later. For right now, I want to point out the manner in which creation came to be. Chapter 1 is full of organization and order. Our God is not a God of chaos or confusion, but of peace and clarity. He separates the darkness from the light. He separates the waters and the dry land. He creates the sun and the moon and the stars to govern over the day and night. In doing all this, he creates a livable environment for all species because he considers the birds of the air and the flowers in the field. He creates the skies by which we can form a timeline and separate our days. He creates the water cycle, magnetism, gravity, and it was all good. The thought and intention that went into each day and detail of creation is astonishing. We also see God's provision in this chapter. If you notice the order in which God created everything, mankind was the very last thing. He knew that if man were to live on the earth without all of the other aspects of creation, he wouldn't have all that he needed. But because God is an intentional provider, he placed every provision in place before mankind even stepped on the scene. Wow, what a thought. Every need was met before it even arose. And it was an ongoing provision. Not only were the crops set in place, but God placed seeds and resources within the vegetation so that it would reproduce and continually provide for them. So this brings us to Genesis chapter 2. We mentioned that God is a God of clarity, but we really see the way that his hierarchies and systems come to play in this chapter. God forms Adam from the dirt and breathes life into his nostrils. Man eats the animal eats the plants eat the dirt, and this is the dirt that Adam was formed from. This is a spectacular cycle of provision and resources and how the circle of life is truly dependent on one another. God gives Adam 3 great gifts in this chapter. The first gift is purpose. God puts Adam in charge of creation and gives him tasks to do. He has him naming animals and tending to the fields. The second gift is will. God tells Adam he is free to eat of any tree in the garden, but that he shouldn't eat from the tree of knowledge because there will be dire consequences. God didn't just tell Adam, "No, don't you dare, bad boy." But he gave him a command, and then he explained why it was important to obey. But at the end of the day, Adam was still free to eat from any tree. Sometimes we misinterpret God's boundaries as stifling, but they're always for our own good. Like when we tell our children not to run across the street without looking both ways, or not to jump off the top of the jungle gym because they might get hurt. But sometimes they run, and sometimes they jump, and many times there are consequences, even if they're not immediate. The third gift that God gave Adam was a woman, because loneliness was God's first not good. So Adam gets a wife, and they live in a perfect world, walking around naked, because there's no such thing as shame. Eve was made to be Adam's helper, and Adam was made to be a good steward over his wife, his gift from God. They lived in a symbiotic relationship with each other in all of creation, every living thing created to glorify God. It required respect and intentionality. God's perfect system operating in unity and in harmony until it wasn't, which brings us to chapter 3. Chapter 3 is where we see what it's like when we're not operating in God's will. Satan was hard at work trying to convince Eve to question what God had said. And there's usually a hint of truth to deception, but it's just not quite right. Satan questions God's authority, his love, his blessings, his very character. And we see this again later in Matthew when Jesus is tempted in the wilderness. But where Jesus succeeded in knowing God's word and his will and thwarting the enemy, Eve unfortunately fell short, as we all do. Eve said that they were not allowed to eat the fruit or even touch it, or else they'd die. And I'm not sure if this is due to Adam trying to prevent Eve from going near the tree, or if he failed to just give her the proper information that God had given to him. But I imagine the serpent saying, "You can touch the fruit. You won't die. See, look, I'll touch it and I'll be just fine. I'm sure you can take a bite." So Eve takes her first mouthful as Adam stood by and watched. Adam, not falling for the temptation, now has to choose whether to obey his Lord or stand in solidarity with his wife in temptation and sin. Unfortunately, Adam chose the gift over the gift giver, which would forever taint their relationship with each other and with God. God returned to the garden where Adam and Eve hid and approached Adam to take accountability for his gift of a woman and his authority over her. After the blame game, God puts consequences on the woman, the work, and the will. We see a perfect contrast between operating in the flesh and by the Spirit. God's design and intention was for us to walk about the earth and in peace and free of shame. This chapter shows us what it's like to not operate in God's will and to not have those things. We see a once symbiotic relationship now at a power struggle. We see the crops that once endlessly provided for us now suffer from decay and pests. And to get that food, man has to toil and sweat where the work used to be easy. But God was not surprised by what happened. And we see the first time that God makes atonement for their sin. And then he makes a promise for a more permanent solution to come. So the theme for this chapter, I would say, is consequence and redemption. Satan might have planted seeds of doubt in Eve's mind, but God had already planted a seed of redemption in her womb. And this hope is still for us today. Because of God's perfect plan, we have redemption in his Son, Jesus Christ.